My guest today is Shrupti Shah, the Managing Director of Government and Public Service Practice at Deloitte. Shrupti, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Let me set just a little bit of context for our discussion today. As we all know, agencies are well on their way on their AI journey. Recent data shows a strong majority are still, though, in their early stages of maturity. The challenges agencies still must overcome include everything from defining and developing trustworthy AI, developing the workforce skill sets they need around data and AI management, and of course, budget and resources, never enough, and as you want to continue to do those investments. Now, despite these challenges, there's a lot of excitement and actually a lot of desire to see how AI can impact agency mission areas and improve their decision making. So for what federal leaders need to continually do to assess, understand when it comes to adopting artificial intelligence, we're going to turn to you, Shrupti Shah. You're our expert today. So let's start at the beginning. There's a lot of excitement around AI. What should government leaders keep in mind, and how is that really different than maybe in the private sector?
So the dynamics of government are very different from the private sector. In the private sector, you have this competitive force that says, you either innovate or you become obsolete. In government, actually, the forces are to keep things in the status quo. It's much riskier for an individual to change the status quo. Unlike the private sector, if you take a risk and it pays off where, you might get a nice bonus or promoted and rewarded, in government, you may take a risk, it pays off, and that's all well and good, and you may get, a nice kind of thank you. But if it goes wrong, you're in front of a Senate committee and your career is on the line. And so the kind of risk-reward ratio is very different in government. And so public servants, and I say this as an ex-public servant, are naturally risk-averse, especially when it comes to adopting brand new, untried or untested technologies.
Now, this has been the case, that risk aversion, for decades. Mm-hmm. You probably can go back to the World War II and beyond about risk aversion. They have to overcome it because AI is changing the way we look at things, the way they make decisions, the way we process information. So I think that's why we're seeing a lot of agencies start to take those baby steps.
Yes.
What's the consideration as they start to kind of do that, crawl, walk, run, for lack of, we'll use that old terminology for technology adoption?
So I think an agency needs to look at not adopting AI for the sake of AI, but where will it really enhance its mission? And so I think there are three key areas where AI can fundamentally help in improving its services to citizens directly, through chatbots, through being able to reduce wait times for services, to be able to make better policy is another one, to be able to combine various sources of data and say, this is where I need to pinpoint this initiative or policy or program to get the maximum impact. So to actually add new nuanced layers to our policy making. And the third one is actually improving back office operations such as procurement, day-to-day operations, some of which are often quite routine or require a common set of decisions. And then, where in my mission is AI going to help?
Let's go through each of those maybe just briefly. I think the reduced wait times, chatbot, citizen services, we're seeing that at places like the Veterans Affairs Department. We're seeing it across a lot of different kind of forward-facing agencies, IRS, SSA. That seems to be something that folks can kind of get their hands around, and that risk aversion is a little lower. They see the risk is lower. Mm-hmm. Is that what you hear when you talk to your clients in the government space about, okay, I can get behind that. That's easy to I have less worrisome.
Yes, I think so. When you can demonstrate that there's a clear impact on service delivery that is beneficial. So is it making something better, faster, cheaper for individuals? Then, that agency has then become free to invest its limited resources in kind of harder problems to solve that can't be addressed with AI. And so it's a fairly kind of logical thing to be able to grasp, but also something that resonates with why people became a public servant. You did it in order to improve services. I'd say that public service is a choice that's not just of a job, it's of a calling. And people want to see, as a public servant, how their day-to-day work impacts other people.
And that actually leads us to, and let's skip over the better policies, but that back office side, because that's very similar there, how they can use AI and other emerging technologies to make better decisions or to understand that side of the back office. Is that another area that you're seeing a lot of excitement around, or a lot of at least interest to do more than dip their toe in?
Yes, and I think it's particularly true of regulators. So there are back office functions where, an inspection regime may go and kind of randomly select, some of its customers to go and audit and to check that they're compliant. AI can help identify those that are, that pose the greatest risk through being able to combine sources of data and make much more informed decisions and get a better return on the investment for the choices they make in terms of where are the riskiest parts of my industry that I need to pay closer attention to in order to protect the public. And so I think even in back office areas you can demonstrate how ultimately it's creating a public good and public value.
I think the introduction of robotics process automation, early kind of that early AI, if you will, or more simple AI, got folks comfortable. Oh, I don't have to do that task, that what they termed low value task, that redundant task. And are you seeing agencies build in that direction? Hey, we used RPA for this. Now we can go that more intelligent automation, more intelligent AI.
Yes, and some agencies do see it as a natural evolution. But I think AI is more than robotics process engineering kind of 2.0. It's an opportunity to radically rethink, how the business of government is done, and provides capabilities beyond routine automation of routine tasks. And so I think while it helps in that journey of level of comfort, to go from RPA to embracing limited uses of AI, it's part of a continuum and a journey that I would say is a middle rather than the end in itself.
I think when we ever talk about new technologies, whether it's AI or cloud or cybersecurity, you pick the topic, there's never an end.
There isn't.
We'll be here forever talking about these.
Absolutely,
and that's great. That's a great part of my job. The last piece, and this kind of fits in well, is the policy side and really bringing the data sources together to understand the policy decisions. And let's be clear, we're not saying AI will make any policy decisions. That's no one's ever going to say that, or at least in our lifetime probably. But going forward, but they can understand, hey, they have more data at their fingertips to understand, hey, this grant impacted this community this way. Maybe that's going to influence how I do the next grant, and so on and so forth. Talk a little bit about that impact.
Exactly. It allows you to bring together diverse data sources. One could be on impact, but another one could be the nature of the community it served. So this policy works particularly well in an urban environment where unemployment levels are like this. But it doesn't work so well here. And therefore, when I'm thinking about where I focus a particular kind of grant, then I'm going to get a better return here than there. And as a public servant, you don't have the time to grasp 40 different data sets to really be able to unpick those nuances, and to have AI be able to identify those patterns for you. Because unless you know exactly what you're looking for, you can't see the pattern, but AI can identify patterns where you may not have been looking.
Are you starting to see, of the three areas that we've kind of gone through, is one ahead of the other? Is one more, when we talk about that risk aversion piece, people feel more comfortable with in the public sector?
I think people are more comfortable with the use of AI when it comes to the direct delivery of citizen services, because they can see an immediate impact in reduced wait times or better citizen satisfaction, better engagement, etc. So that, I think, is naturally the one where agencies are and are likely to feel comfortable kind of dipping their toe in the water.
I think the one that has the most potential, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, of course, is the policy one. I really find that fascinating, this idea of pulling all these data sets and understanding how that policy can work, again, to use your example, in this urban area, but not in the rural area, or with this type of population, but not maybe that type of population. We need to tweak it a little bit. Does that garner a lot of excitement among the federal executives you talk with?
I think it's harder to explain, but those who are the federal executives who are already in the kind of evaluation shops, the evidence-based policy making area, or the strategy areas of their agency, they see a lot of potential in this. It's one that is probably the most difficult to communicate to a lay audience. And therefore it's harder to kind of get a big movement of support around it. But certainly those who are used to kind of working with a lot of data to get the best out of their policies and programs are very excited about this.
I imagine as well that once you can show how this all works together, which I'll put you on the spot for a second. Any examples that you can think of, anything that comes to mind where you think an agency or an organization is doing this already today, or at least trying to dip their toes in, but the more you can show it, oh, okay, I get it. Now I can be more excited for it, because as you said, sometimes it's hard to get your head around it.
So I have an analogy. It's not AI, but it was an example that the UK tax authority did by using data and analysis. They had a group of people who were constantly late paying their taxes. There was about 100,000 of them. And they used behavioral science, so lessons from how people make decisions, to alter 10 different letters. And one group got the original letter, and 9 different groups got, and they were all randomly selected, a slightly different letter. With one letter, they were able to increase by 30 percentage points the number of people who returned their taxes on time. And they estimated that actually the extra inspectors would have cost £30 million. And so I wrote a blog about it. It was called The Sentence That Saved £30 million or $50 million at the time.
Great headline, by the way, as a news guy, great headline.
And so, like, that's just, a very lay kind of randomized control trial using very simple statistical methods. If you can imagine what's the potential is with AI and advanced calculations of trends and data and analysis, the amount of money that could be saved, or the amount of resources that could be better targeted, and the impact we could have, I think that is truly where the potential of AI really lies. I think there's also another thing, which is bringing more data and evidence and analysis into policy making. You can show that, often policies are age-old and they're trusted to work, but they may not work anymore. And so by really calculating whether they're really effective, it's possible to identify policies that may no longer be working and need to be retired in favor of those that work better as well. So it's not just improving existing policies, but clearing the way for better, sharper policies that may have a better impact on people's lives.
I think a lot of agencies and a lot of organizations are guilty of piling on the policies and never getting rid of the old ones. It's like cleaning out the house, right?
Yes,
we all
exactly.
Pack rat.
Yeah.
Shrupti, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation about adoption of AI. My guest today is Shrupti Shah, the Managing Director of Government and Public Service Practice at Deloitte. I'm Jason Miller, and you're listening to the discussion AI in Government, the Risk of Adopting versus Not Adopting, sponsored by Deloitte on Federal News Network. Welcome back. You're listening to the discussion AI in Government, the Risk of Adopting versus Not Adopting, sponsored by Deloitte on Federal News Network. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guest is Shrupti Shah, the Managing Director of Government and Public Sector Practice at Deloitte. Now, Shrupti, last segment we talked a lot about the risk aversion of agencies. We talked about this idea of where they can start kind of dipping their toe in it, and you mentioned 3 really good examples. At the same time, what if an agency or a federal leader says, I'm just not going to do it? It's not worth it. I don't see any benefit. What's that risk of not adopting AI at this point?
I can really understand why a government executive would say it's not worth the risk. I don't want to do it, because there's a lot of factors that lead to people being scared of like taking on new technologies. And as we talked about earlier, it's different than in the private sector. But I would also say that often when we think about risk, we weigh it in terms of like the status quo versus doing. But also we need to think about the risk of the status quo, the risk of doing, and the risk of not doing. And that's incredibly real as well. So if I don't go down this path, where am I leaving myself vulnerable? And in the case of AI, I think, I am losing opportunities to tighten my security and my to reduce my vulnerability against malicious actors, because they will be using this technology without a doubt. So lower preparedness in general. I think it's also important that as we seek to attract the brightest and best and technological minds to government, if we say we're not embracing this huge fundamental part of new technology, we're going to lose the war for talent, and we're going to lose those minds to the private sector, where we really want them doing good in the public sector. And we also kind of risk lagging in terms of international competitiveness. And finally, in terms of citizen services, all of the major retail agent organizations that we interact with on a daily basis, whether it's our internet shopping or other services, commercial services we interact with, are using AI, and they're using it to improve the customer experience. If the customer experience or the citizen experience from public services is so much behind that of commercial, we risk losing trust in government, because we're so behind and we're not meeting expectations that have been raised by private sector counterpart services.
I think the cyber piece is clear. As you mentioned, if you're not using it or looking at it, and the bad guys are, the bad guys then probably have a leg up. But let's maybe go through each of the other ones. I'm going to work backwards. The citizen services, trust in government. That piece is so critical, and I think that the Biden administration has really focused a lot on improving citizen services, addressing the trust issues. How do you make that connection between, hey, if I use AI, I get better citizen services?
So it wouldn't just be an adoption of AI per se. It's not going to magically solve all your customer service. I'm sorry to say your customer service issues, but it is possible to take a clear look at the services you provide from a customer perspective and say, where does AI have the ability to make this service better, faster, cheaper, so that my agency is able to focus its limited resources on things that can't be supported by AI? Does it save on transaction costs? Does it save the average wait time that someone needs to apply for a government service or a benefit to them receiving it? Does it actually make the whole process simpler, less cumbersome on the individual, because they're not answering the same question 4 times on 3 different forms? Does it also reduce the amount of human interaction that's needed on behalf of the agency, so those agency workers can spend more of their time doing what they signed up to public service for, which is interacting directly with citizens rather than the pieces of paper?
I'm glad you brought up the process simpler piece, because there's obviously frustration from all of us, no matter if you're dealing with public sector or private sector. You know my information. I called you. You asked me to identify myself through my address. I gave it to you. And then you asked me, what's your address? You have it in front of you, right? So I think that's a key piece. But at the same time, agencies also, the workforce side is there's never enough people to answer enough calls, the wait times. We're seeing that with SSA, with CMS, with IRS, some of those agencies. Is that, again, another easy is not the right word, but more comfortable, less risky approach to adding AI? Is that the conversation you're having with some of the clients too?
Yes, absolutely. I think direct contact with customers, especially when the queries are rather common, AI is able to sort through kind of simple language and be able to find the answer for citizens much faster than an individual than you could get from an individual by waiting for them to become available. And so that's kind of readily understandable. But I'd like to go back to your point about answering the same question again and again. And this is an example, a rather sad example from a while ago, where my mother passed away in the UK, and on picking up the death certificate, I was asked if I wanted to sign up for a service called Tell Us Once. And you can imagine it's one of the most challenging, most difficult times of your life. And I just filled in the form and said yes. Over the course of the next few months, all government agencies, state and local, including, as well as banks, the Postal Service, sent me a letter saying, we're really sorry about your loss. Here's what you need to do to settle your mother's accounts and affairs. It was a really challenging time with so much going on, and there the government was connecting, in this case, this one piece of data, which is the registration of the death on a death certificate, and helping me at a really, really challenging time of my life. And so I think, this was a process issue, but if you could imagine AI being used to be able to help citizens at particular life stages where they need to interact with a bunch of government agencies. In the example I just used, even banks and commercial entities were using this service to close down her affairs as well, and to help me with the bureaucracy of that. So AI has the fundamental potential to be able to, serve citizens with one voice in an empathetic, truly person-centric way. And I think that's where the real advantageous kind of benefits will be as far as citizens can see them.
Really do appreciate you sharing that example. Obviously, sorry for your loss. It doesn't make things easier, but at least you're not, can we see your death certificate? Can you see the death certificate over and over and over again? I think that just because it's a reminder of the loss. So I think it's a really great example, and we should maybe America could adopt that.
Yes.
Want to shift over to the barrier side, because so the risk of not adopting is real. You laid that out. Okay, but so I want to adopt it. What do I have to overcome? I mentioned a few at the front end. The budget resources are always going to be challenging. The workforce side of it. There's this finding the right use case. What are you seeing as some of those biggest barriers, and how to overcome them?
So I think there's three main barriers. One is, simple capacity issues. Do I have the skills, capabilities, and resources to be able to do this? And there are ways to be able to overcome that through being able to share resources, precious resources across agencies, skills across agencies, to pool necessary capabilities so that, ones that are particularly rare can have multiple impacts in different areas. Another barrier is looking at the cultural side of things. This is a big change for a lot of people in the nature of work, and public sector employees and their representatives might naturally be quite fearful of the change that it will mean, in terms of the job that they signed up for and the way that they wanted to serve the public. And another cultural component is the risk aversion that we've already talked about. Those can be addressed by, I think, really looking at job augmentation rather than job replacement, saying this actually frees up workers to do what they want to do more of, and less of the downside of their job, which is the kind of lower value bureaucratic tasks, to really kind of bring the value of what the public service element to their work. In terms of risk aversion, I think piloting is a great way to address that risk. There are some regulators around the world that have adopted regulatory sandboxes where they've partnered with industry to test new products and services in a safe way so that they can, assess whether that product or service is safe for public consumption at later times. And so kind of partnering with to reduce later risks whilst not kind of impeding innovation in the industry that they're regulating. And then the final one is around regulatory certainty. That's something the private sector doesn't have. Yes, they are regulated, but government faces an additional layer of concerns, quite rightly around equity, equal access to services, and I think credit is due to this government, the US government, and governments around the world for rapidly putting in place series of directives and rules and frameworks so that agencies know the parameters within which they can operate and the principles that they need to abide by. Now, as we kind of evolve, the rules will need to evolve with us, but I really commend governments that are working kind of with their agencies not to impede innovation and the adoption of AI, but working with them to harness its potential in a safe and responsible way.
Shrupti, we have about a minute left of our conversation, unfortunately. So before I let you go, I want to ask you to leave the audience. What's the big takeaway from our conversation? What do you want to make sure? What's the message that they get about adopting AI and why they should versus not?
So I'd say three things. First, be very focused around the mission. Don't adopt AI for AI's sake. Where is it going to really help the mission of my agency? Secondly, think about not just the risks of doing, but the risks of not doing and, being left behind, both the level of commercial services, but also internationally, and the vulnerabilities that you may put through. And that it's not a kind of end game, it's an evolution. And so it can take small steps. You don't need to do everything everywhere all at once. Take it as an evolution of short steps to slowly harness it piece by piece.
All right, great advice. Unfortunately, we're out of time for today. So let me thank my guest. Shrupti Shah is the Managing Director of Government and Public Service Practice at Deloitte. Shrupti, thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you.
I'm Jason Miller, and you've been listening to the discussion AI in Government, the risk of adopting versus not adopting, sponsored by Deloitte on Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search Deloitte.